This one's a classic.
The dynamics of Old School MapleStory are very interesting, especially with regards to how one class's skills might affect either the gameplay of another class or that class's impact in various content. Bowmaster was given one of the most impactful skills that the game ever saw. So impactful, in fact, that everyone wanted it back in the day. So impactful that it's still used to this day by every single class in the game and has barely been changed. It's easy to look back at Bowmaster and see them as nothing more than a Sharp Eyes delivery service, especially with the Night Lord meta that was so prevalent in OSMS. But this class has a very interesting story that extends well beyond that. They have so many unique tools that are only shared by their marksman counterparts, and even then they still manage to differentiate themselves in very significant ways. Bowmasters have always been quite the capable class, providing support and single-target damage that was considered to be pretty good, and I think their independence is a trait that is often overlooked. They've been overshadowed in the past, but today I'm giving them the spotlight. So, what was Bowmaster like in Old School MapleStory?
Doesn't matter how many arrows I shoot, I never ever miss.
Today, we're telling the story of my buddy Terransgo, Bowmaster extraordinaire, leecher on a rope, and someone who referred to Toro Macy's as giant lunar bears. A future Bowmaster's primary stat is Dex, and they require 25 to get their first job advancement. This is very helpful for leveling to 10 as their damage will be sufficient and consistent. In all honesty, magicians might be the only ones who truly suffer on Maple Island. It seems like every other class has it easy. A Bowmaster starts out their journey as an archer in first job. They don't bring anything new to the table that we haven't already seen before, but we've never seen these skills so early on or in such a configuration. The first of these is a simple average skill that you might expect to find in first job. The Blessing of Amazon is a skill that passively increases accuracy, which is exceptionally pointless on a class whose main stat is Dex. Dex gives 0.8 accuracy per point of Dex, so archers truly don't ever struggle to hit monsters, as they have the highest accuracy of any class in the game alongside Corsairs. A skill that only increases accuracy is nothing more than a waste of points on an archer. The Blessing of Amazon seems like a skill you could skip, but unfortunately that's not quite the case. Leveling it to 3 unlocks access to 2 major skills in an archer's kit, so it's a mandatory pickup even if it was useless. The first of these 2 skills is the Eye of Amazon. This is a passive skill that increases the attacking range of an equipped bow. This is yet another skill that separates archers from the rest of the pack. Gunslingers don't have the horizontal range that an archer has, and even a rogue's keen eyes skills can't match the effectiveness of the Eye of Amazon. The difference between a total range of a rogue's throwing stars and an archer's arrows is often negligible, usually only being observable in testing scenarios, but arrows do have a slightly longer range, which is a win for archers. We'll discuss this more in a moment. An archer's next first job skill is infinitely more useful. Critical Shot adds a chance to crit with any attack. At max level, this is a 40% chance to deal 200% damage. This skill means that archers are the only job to receive critical hit chance within their first job advancement, as well as the only class besides Assassin who ever receive passive crit chance, if we're talking about the original 4 jobs. And it's super satisfying to see those purple numbers show up. Archers are very well recognized for their critical hit capabilities, as we'll eventually learn. Next up is Focus. This is another one of those first job buffs that's almost good, but not quite there entirely. We already know that increasing accuracy on an archer is pointless, but Focus also increases avoidability, which I've said many times before is a tiny increase in survivability, or at the very least, potion cost. Depending on what level you could get this skill to while still maxing out your core skills, usually level 9, you might end up spending more in MP by casting it than you would save from the added avoidability for a while. Now we get into the first attacking skill an archer receives, Arrow Blow. This skill simply fires a single arrow that deals 260% damage. Other than how annoying it was that the word blow was censored for a very long time in GMS, this skill was a bit of a topic of debate for a while. People loved to try and crunch the numbers to figure out if it could beat double shot in terms of DPS, but we all eventually realized that that's not what it's for. What Arrow Blow offers instead is higher single-line damage that can knock back enemies more easily, which is actually very valuable for archers. This concept of knocking back enemies with high-damaging single-line attacks is something we'll see again in the future with another class as well. And now we've reached the final skill in an archer's kit, Double Shot. After getting a point in Arrow Blow, similar to Magic Claw's Magic Bolt requirement, this skill would be unlocked, and at max level it could deal 130% damage twice by firing 2 arrows. Just like most first job skill builds, an archer's ideal build is very simple. They're given quite the luxury in first job compared to a warrior or a magician who both struggle early on in their own ways. Eye of Amazon is usually maxed first, followed by critical shot, then double shot and focus. Honestly, an archer's biggest concern is being able to afford arrows, which cost like 1 meso apiece. It's just about as cheap to keep arrows stocked on an archer as it is to keep subis recharged on a future assassin. Being a ranged attacker, they have little worry of actually taking damage since they can just snipe enemies, and they're given plenty of opportunities to do so in first job, where it arguably matters the most. Arrow Blow is usually not taken early on, as it doesn't add much value to the class at level 1. If a player is funded though, it's not uncommon for them to grab double shot early, but without that funding, it's not worth it. An archer does just fine using regular attacks until they bring in enough mesos to meet double shot's MP demands. Like we've seen with a few skills, double shot doubles its MP cost at level 11, going from 8 per shot to 16 per shot. It wasn't uncommon for poor archers to save their skill points at level 10 and then later add the remaining amount all at once so that they received the most benefit alongside the doubled MP cost. This would be updated sometime during the lost era of version 12 to 22 to be a more reasonable and linear increase. Again, with funding, maxing double shot before critical shot actually adds more DPS, a difference of 28% according to one source, but I'm not sure this number is necessarily representative of final damage. Damage calculations are complex, and an archer would need to be able to afford using double shot exclusively to even see this difference in damage, whereas critical shot is passive and doesn't cost any MP. And at the end of the day, it simply doesn't matter that much. We're talking about first job, which is a relatively small section of a player's career, and DPS isn't a huge concern during this time. The archer just needs to be able to two-shot enemies. An archer takes on the role of a bit of a hybrid class in the early levels of first job. With their base stats of dex and secondary of strength, they could either choose to go a melee route for a while or stick purely to ranged attacks. Either option would actually work fine. Monsters at this level didn't deal enough damage that choosing the melee route was super detrimental in terms of potion costs, and if you were truly trying to save mesos, you wouldn't be able to afford the cost of arrows for a little while. In this scenario, Slime Tree would be a melee archer's best friend. It wasn't the only option, but it was a very easy option, and it might have been the best option. If the archer chose to simply use ranged attacks with a bow, Hennis' Hunting Ground is the most obvious first choice. The appeal of this map didn't simply come from the fact that it's so iconic, it's also the fact that every level of Hennis' Hunting Ground, aside from the bottom level with the snails, has a platform where an archer can stand and snipe the monsters. Any ranged class could take advantage of this really, and it was smart to do so since pretty much every single ranged attacker had innately high accuracy, so they were able to take down the green mushrooms on the top level of the map early on without worrying about getting hit. As long as other people were killing the other monsters down below, this was good EXP. Moving further into first job around the early 20s, Hennis' Hunting Ground continued to be a decent training spot, but other options began to open up. Pig Beach, Ant Tunnel, Wild Boars, etc. The best options for training in first job were monsters who would move slowly and not rush down the poor archer who required a minimum distance to be able to fire an arrow at an enemy. Archers didn't have the tools to deal with this in first job. so all they could do was equip their little light bottom boots and run away until they were able to fire an arrow. Archers were not as lucky as future Night Lords were with their damage formula. Dex had a larger impact than strength, but strength was still factored into an archer's every attack. This made the min-maxing of primary and secondary stats the slightest bit less important on an archer, since strength would still contribute a little bit of damage. Optimally, towards the end of OSMS, when all of the strengthless bows were available, archers would pursue a strengthless build until endgame, where they'd start aiming for a low-strength build that allowed them to equip the highest level bows available while still maximizing their dex. We'll discuss this more when it becomes relevant. A future hunter is going to be using pretty much bows exclusively after getting through the levels where a melee weapon was viable. And just like with a future assassin's Meba, archers also have a level 25 weapon that has a 1 attack speed advantage over every other first job bow. I don't know what the deal is, but it is consistent that if you look at every single class where attack speed actually matters, they have a level 25 weapon that's just faster than everything else. It's weird, but it has to be intentional. For some reason, pirates were not given this courtesy with their level 25 weapons, but we can discuss that in the future. Either way, this makes the battle bow the best first job bow, and it's only matched in attack speed by the Red Viper at level 35. After receiving booster in second job, this difference in attack speed mattered a lot less, but this is the best option until that point. In first job, going strengthless wasn't so much of an advantage over a normal strength build without a busted formula like Rogue's Lucky 7, so it wasn't uncommon to see archers simply adding the strength they needed until they were able to equip their level 25 bow. From that point on, it's just equipping bows as you can get the strength for them. Assassins, hunters, crossbowmen, and gunslingers are the 4 classes in Old School MapleStory that use ammo, at least before we get into the realm of Cygnus Knights and beyond. And for future hunters, they had 5 choices available. Regular arrows were the most common, since they were found in almost every potion shop in the Maple world, but other options did exist. Some of these wouldn't be available until after the beta period ended. For example, after the release of Showa Town in version 54, hunters had an ammo advantage over their crossbowmen counterparts. Doran in Showa Town had a shop that sold 2 things of note: cider and red arrows for bows. Red arrows are the highest tier, strongest arrows that can be used, and they were directly purchasable from this NPC. The crossbow equivalent of these red arrows are the blue arrows, which were not available for sale in this shop. In fact, they were never purchasable from any NPC in OSMS. This wasn't the worst thing in the world. Hunters and crossbowmen could both get by without these arrows, but it was a bit of a slap in the face for crossbowmen that they really didn't deserve. Red arrows for bows had been in the files since version 31, which is not a particularly relevant update. Mushroom Shrine was released for us in GMS in version 39, and it was meant to contain Showa Town, but it didn't. We had to wait quite a while for Showa Town to be censored and brought to GMS. The only monsters who dropped red arrows were located in either Ninja Castle or Showa Town, with Ninja Castle coming out in version 90 shortly before Big Bang, and Showa Town coming out in version 54. So, Doran wasn't the only source of these arrows, but he was by far the best source. In GMS, though, we also had diamond arrows that were equally available for both bowmasters and marksmen. They were available before version 59, the release of Crimsonwood Forest, but only from a few NLC enemies, so not in very large supply. After Crimsonwood Forest was released, diamond arrows were purchasable from the NPC Mo in Dead Man's Gorge, which is a map found within Crimsonwood Forest. The catch was that you had to be an ally of the Raven Ninja clan to purchase these arrows, which required at least partial completion of the associated questline. If a bowmaster was actually using real arrows, which was usually only done in a min-maxing scenario, they were more than likely either using red arrows or diamond arrows. Overall, though, arrow usage wasn't all that common for your average bowmaster. We'll talk about why that is in a moment, but they were another source of raw weapon attack that endgame players would make use of in boss fights for their very slight boost in damage that they provided. Archers suffered noticeably more from their minimum range requirement than future assassins or gunslingers did because archers were unable to fire arrows while airborne. Executing a jump and an attack on the same frame would allow for this, but that required precision inputs, and it didn't grant as much freedom as a future assassin or gunslinger had with their jump attacking. Jump attacking isn't just for show. It serves a practical purpose by allowing the character to move while in their attacking animation, which was usually not possible on an archer. Magicians were also unable to jump attack without these frame-perfect inputs, but they didn't have a minimum range for their attacks, so it mattered far less on magicians than it does on archers. A lot of times, players wouldn't take great advantage of this, doing it just because they could even when it didn't matter, but archers had to quickly learn to master jump attacking, assuming their keyboard was capable of those inputs, and they learned to utilize every pixel of distance they could get, since they really had no other choice in first job. Bows have a stat associated with them simply called knockback. This stat represents the chance for a swung bow to knock back the enemy, regardless of how much damage the hit dealt. This would only occur when the archer was too close to an enemy, outside of their minimum distance required to actually shoot the bow or crossbow. The lowest value ever found on either of these weapon types is the Aka bow. For the most part though, you'd be starting out with around 25% knockback chance on low-level bows, and the highest level bows would have a base knockback chance in the high 60s to 70s. This stat was pretty relevant, as Bowmaster mains will recall, since there was a huge growth period for a future Bowmaster where they were stuck knocking back enemies quite often. Eventually, this knockback stat would no longer matter, but it was important for a very long time. We briefly covered how MapleStory handles damage calculations, mostly when we were discussing Night Lords, but hitbox and damage registration is something I've never actually talked about. It's pretty simple, really. When an attack is executed, in this case a ranged attack, a check is performed that detects whether a monster is within the appropriate range. This determination happens instantly, and any movement the monster performs after the check is not taken into consideration. They can exit the range while the projectile is moving towards them and still get hit. When I learned that archers have a further attacking range than assassins, confirmation bias kicked in, and when playing archer, I would often observe monsters running away from me as quickly as possible right after I fired an arrow. I interpreted this as archers having a massively further attacking range, even though the same exact thing would happen with an assassin. The truth is, archers do have superior range, but the difference is tiny and barely even observable in practice. Now, I don't mean to downplay an archer's strengths, I just want to be clear about the reality and not create a false narrative throughout the rest of this story. I'll be mentioning an archer's superior attacking range occasionally throughout the video, so I wanted to make sure we all start out on the same page. After countless accidental bow swings on monsters who were just a few pixels too close, Terrence Go reaches level 30 and is allowed to receive second job. Second job for a Bowmaster is the Hunter. This is where they really start to come alive and carve out a niche in the world of MapleStory with their highly unique skills that give them versatility that no other class possesses. Archers are probably the only class in OSMS who struggle with their second job advancement. There's usually no issue of damage or survivability, but often they will run into the issue of not being able to shoot their bow because the monsters will be in their face so often that the archer can never reach the minimum distance required to shoot their weapon. A melee weapon might have solved this issue. Maybe this was a problem only I ever ran into? I don't know, but it's something I observed. We all know what's coming first in a hunter's kit. With the exception of second job magicians, every class in OSMS starts out second job with a mastery skill that gives them higher minimum damage and extra accuracy with a specific type of weapon. Bowmastery is pretty unfortunate for hunters. The accuracy boost is absolutely worthless by second job, so they really only benefit from the mastery. Otherwise, this skill holds the keys to unlocking a few other skills, and it's a pretty important core skill to max. Or at least get to level 19, where the mastery increase reaches its highest value. We've briefly discussed Final Attack when we covered Dark Knights, and sadly the story isn't much different with Final Attack Bow. If anything, I'd be even more worried about taking Final Attack on a hunter than I would be on a spearman. Level 3 Mastery is required to unlock this skill, but it was usually skipped. In the beta era though, players were eager to level up Final Attack as early as possible. Mastery also unlocked access to Bow Booster once it reached level 5, which is another staple of second job classes. Between the Battle Bow and the Red Viper, which both have 5 attack speed, the fastest of any bow available, Bow Booster became slightly lower priority, similar to what we saw with Assassin. Level 5 Bow Booster unlocks access to Soul Arrow. This skill is the reason why hunters don't need arrows. At max level, for 600 whole seconds, all ammo requirements will be removed from the hunter. No arrows even need to be present in the inventory to use the skill, and it lasts so much longer than any other buff you can find at this level. It didn't even need to be fully maxed to be useful, and it wasn't uncommon to see Bowmasters just not max it. Despite common belief, Soul Arrow does not take into account the bonus damage from the arrows in the player's inventory. The only true attacking skill that hunters receive is Arrow Bomb. This skill is very unique and opened the door to one of their best grinding spots in second job. Even before that area was added, this skill was still an amazing mobbing tool. Arrow Bomb will fire an arrow that explodes upon impact with an enemy, and this explosion has a fairly generous range that deals even higher damage to the enemies that get hit by its splash damage. Not every class was given a good second job mobbing skill, but hunters were blessed with Arrow Bomb. The final skill in a hunter's kit is called Power Knockback. This is a forced melee attack that will swing a bow with an increased knockback chance, plus 40% at max level, and up to 6 enemies can be hit at once. This simply adds to the knockback chance of the equipped bow, so as long as the bow has 60% knockback chance, using max level Power Knockback will guarantee that any monster hit will indeed be knocked back. Even without the 100% guaranteed chance to knock back the enemy, PKB was a very welcome and necessary addition to a hunter's kit. So why would a hunter choose to skip Final Attack? It probably won't come as any surprise that this skill simply isn't that good in its first iteration. It was pretty bad on Spearmen, but for hunters it can be an infinitely more impactful hindrance, as well as outright dangerous at times. Double Shot plus Final Attack is a damage increase for sure. The quick arrow fired by Final Attack will result in higher single target DPS, but just like we saw with Spearmen, Final Attack in second job has a hugely negative impact on multi-target skills. In this case, Arrow Bomb. Arrow Bomb will trigger Final Attack, and you might be thinking that Final Attack would duplicate the effect of Arrow Bomb or something that makes sense, but it doesn't do this. Final Attack, when triggered by Arrow Bomb, will always fire a single regular arrow that hits only one enemy. This can be bad for a number of reasons on a hunter. First of all, if you're using Arrow Bomb to keep enemies at bay, suddenly proccing Final Attack will not only lock your character in place during the animation, but it will also allow all but one of the enemies in front of you to continue moving towards you if they weren't successfully stunned. If you're fighting enemies who can hit hard, this becomes a very dangerous interaction. Generally, archers are not well known for their survivability. They receive multiple tools that help in that regard, but they're still a squishy ranged attacking class at the end of the day. Even if you didn't care about the loss of damage, Final Attack will absolutely put a hunter in danger more than one might expect. As much as we love the idea of Final Attack, the reality is that it's bad on every class in Old School MapleStory. But there was actually one period of time where it was considered to be very good. Old guides from the beta era list Final Attack as a powerful tool that would allow archers to grind at their endgame beta spots, and it was commonly believed to be a good skill. This may have been true at the time. Final Attack would greatly increase damage output against the stone golems in Sleepywood and even the Tauros in the Sleepywood dungeon. This was simply a development of this era. I just spoke about how Final Attack is worthless, perhaps even dangerous, but back in these days, the best spots for basically every class were filled with strong monsters who would mostly be taken on one at a time. Quality over quantity during the beta era. I believe that if we saw players reaching higher levels, and more importantly, if we had third job during this time, they'd quickly realize that Final Attack was a crutch that would no longer be necessary after a certain point. Since we never really observed players reaching that level in the beta, we have this weird historic period where final attack was actually beneficial for the majority of players. Something hunters will have started to observe by now is their unstable damage. Critical shot gave them really high critical damage while not affecting the damage of their regular attacks. So a couple unlucky rolls on crit chance could turn an easy kill into a kill that legitimately takes 50% longer. This was not a barrier for the class's training rates, and it would actually be of benefit to them later, but it was something that would start to rear its ugly head in second job. Unfortunately, two-shotting mobs for a hunter doesn't always mean every single kill takes 2 shots. There were a lot of options for training on a hunter in Old School MapleStory, but the majority of the best maps weren't added until much later. During the beta era, hunters were pretty much restricted to the same areas as everyone else. Ant Tunnel and Wild Boars were some decent options for the early 30s, but these were both pretty tough, featuring densely packed monsters who moved fast. It simply wasn't easy to train as a hunter in the beta era. Fire Boars would be a good choice until nearly level 50, at which point stone golems begin to provide better EXP rates. I've mentioned Monkey Forest 2 a number of times already, and this is a map that was very forgettable before it received a complete redesign in version 49. This map hosted exclusively lupins and zombie lupins, and because of its unique layout, it became accessible to hunters by the mid to late 30s, after they got through the painful grind at fire boars and other miscellaneous enemies in the early 30s. Monkey Forest 2 was such an amazing training spot that it could legitimately last a hunter until they reached level 60, at which point it would start to become quite slow. Most hunters would leave by the mid-50s in favor of other options. The reason Monkey Forest 2 was such a good training spot for hunters specifically was because of its unique layout that was not shared by any other map in the game. Plenty of areas, such as the Voodoo map and Straw Target Dummy maps, were simply a single, long, flat platform that the monsters would spawn on. This was a great design for a map, but it wasn't the best possible layout for a hunter. Arrow Bomb, which we discussed in second job, is a very unique skill. As we know, when Arrow Bomb hits an enemy, it explodes and deals splash damage in a range around it. The splash damage is actually stronger than the initial hit, and this is an important factor to remember. When training at Monkey Forest 2, hunters would stand somewhere around here, outside of the lupin's attacking range, and fire Arrow Bomb at the middle platform. This would cause the initial hit of Arrow Bomb to target a lupin on the middle platform, and the splash damage range was just large enough that it would hit the enemies on the platforms above and below the targeted lupin. In an ideal scenario, this would result in the targeted lupin taking the least amount of damage, with everything else around it being taken out before it fell. What actually happened was not quite as ideal, but it still worked and could be adjusted for. In reality, things often wouldn't play out like this. Because Arrow Bomb's splash damage targets the nearest monsters, it would instead hit the enemies on the middle platform next to the targeted lupin before reaching the upper and lower platforms. This would quickly clear out the middle platform's monsters, and then there'd only be one weak lupin remaining who had already been damaged by Arrow Bomb's initial hit. A hunter's unstable damage output would mean that crits would play a role in this clear speed as well. A few crits placed in the wrong location could cause the spawns to become imbalanced before the targeted lupin was even dead. In practice, most hunters would find themselves having to stand in these spots instead, so that their arrows could target whatever enemy was closest between the two platforms they were able to hit. Regardless of the fact that the theoretical approach to Monkey Forest 2 was not quite so effective in practice, the alternative method of attacking two platforms at once always worked, and it worked well. By the time a hunter would be considering leaving this area around the early to mid-50s, they'd be getting upwards of 40% EXP per hour training here solo. This might sound like a lot, but it's actually not an insane improvement over some of the beta-era offerings, though it was still an improvement, and perhaps most importantly, it was easier on the wallet. Training at Monkey Forest 2 required almost no potion usage outside of keeping up with Arrow Bomb's MP cost, and it was so mindless and easy compared to the usual grinding conditions that hunters were forced to endure before this that players would often stay here far longer. If they were willing to sacrifice a bit of EXP rates, a hunter could also make really good money at Monkey Forest 2 by picking up and selling the cursed doll drops from the zombie lupins. Hunters and clerics were really the only two classes who could farm this item effectively while also getting good EXP rates. They were in pretty high demand because of the quest Rowan the Fairy and the Cursed Dolls, which gave a total of 9 fame and a level 40 hat. Monkey Forest 2 would eventually fall off by level 60, at which point most hunters will be looking to grind somewhere else, but this is its legacy, hidden deep in Alinea and remembered primarily by hunters. After the release of Crimsonwood Forest in version 59, there was an extremely fascinating training spot that opened up for hunters. Taking a very specific route would lead the player to one of these crossroads maps, where there's a single Wind Raider spawn with a separate platform to the side that can be used as a sniping spot. Sniping is something we see utilized on ranged attackers quite a bit, and archers were some of the most prolific snipers. This crossroads map had it all. It was uncontested since it was a niche spot for ranged attackers who fell within a very specific level range. The Wind Raider spawn was separated by a platform, meaning it could never rush down the player, and this allowed for completely mindless training. It was probably one of the most relaxing spots for a hunter to train at, actually. There's a very delicate balance between doing enough damage to kill the Wind Raider in a reasonable amount of time, while also not doing so much damage that you kill it too quickly and are then stuck waiting around for it to respawn. This balance is usually struck in the early 50s, and each Wind Raider gives a massive 800 EXP per kill. Training here is better EXP than most other sniping spots, but just like those other sniping spots, it wasn't the fastest option and it could get boring quickly. I've personally trained here a lot. It's a very nostalgic grinding spot for me. After sniping a single Wind Raider starts to become too easy, Wind Raiders at lower ascent become a viable option as well. This map really shines for ranged attackers, and hunters are no exception. Ranged sniping maps like this were still king throughout Second Job, as power knockback wasn't effective enough to allow hunters to train in crowded maps. This is a pain that a lot of archers will be very familiar with. There's a point that's reached where if the player is spending too much time using power knockback to keep mobs away from them, that training spot just becomes unviable. And before additions like Lower Ascent and Crossroads, hunters had limited sniping options in late Second Job. In the 60s, hunters could start training at Florina Beach, specifically the map Hot Sand, which contained torties and clangs. They weren't the slowest moving monsters, but the map they were on was large and sparsely populated, providing a sufficient amount of range between the hunter and the enemies. That is, of course, assuming the hunter wasn't traversing through the upper platforms. With an Ice Lightning partner taking care of these platforms, this map would be amazing for a hunter, but I really don't think hunters could grind here solo. In general, golems and hot sand enemies were the best options for endgame training in the beta era. As a hunter became strong enough, they could even travel to Sleepywood and train on the dark stone golems deep in the Sleepy Dungeon. This is an area that was forgotten by time, but it was once an endgame training spot for certain classes. Hunters couldn't reasonably take on enemies much more dangerous than this for a while. Once they were able to, though, they found themselves at the intensely pot-burning Toro Spears and Toro Maces, as all classes eventually do. These Toro Maces and Toro Spears hit hard, and they were unrelenting in their approach. Training on these mobs was tough and expensive, but a hunter's ability to stun enemies with Arrow Bomb would prove extremely useful here. This is a tool that other ranged attackers didn't have access to yet, and it started to prove its value when fighting these tough endgame monsters. Skilled hunters were even good at taking down these mobs. The best bow available at the time was locked behind the Toro Maces, the more powerful of the two. The Asiatic bow was the most powerful bow available in the beta era. I mean, you could stick with your Olympus, which dropped from wild cargoes, but Terransco had bigger dreams than that. Taking on Tauros would be a dangerous, potion-draining experience, and it was the only way to acquire that best-in-slot bow. After this, there was nothing else in the beta era. MapleStory was eventually launched in May 2005, and all beta progress was wiped clean, and everyone started from zero in the official full-release servers. . The full release was massively impactful on the game. It contained Ossyria, which meant Orbis and El Nath were available. El Nath became the new in-game training spot, possessing monsters up to level 90, which gave players a much higher soft level cap that could be reached. Both Orbis and El Nath held a few nice training spots for hunters. A spot I've personally utilized in the past is Cloud Park 6. I don't believe this map was all that popular of a training spot, but for ranged attackers, it had a very nice layout with a lot of platforms from which one could snipe the enemies. This would have been good around the mid-40s until the high 50s. El Nath also brought a new option for mid-level hunters. Zombies were a great choice after level 50. They fell out of favor with most classes as other areas were released in the future, and this fallout was at least partly due to their distance from El Nath. It took a very long time to reach these enemies who didn't have great drops and also started to lose out in EXP rates compared to later editions. In their prime era though, they were an amazing choice. They moved slowly, had a great HP to EXP ratio, and perhaps best of all, they possessed ranged attacks that usually kept them out of the minimum range of a poor hunter's bow. Zombies are incredibly iconic and well-known monsters, and archers seriously thrived here. After taking down thousands of zombies, Terransko finally reaches level 70 and can advance to third job. The third job advancement of a hunter is a ranger. The collection of skills granted to a ranger is an odd mix. There are multiple weaknesses that are addressed and strengths that are capitalized on. It seems archers feel this compensation for their shortcomings with skills that improve upon them more than other classes do. Whether there's any truth to that, I'm not sure, it's just how I feel. The first skill that addresses one of Ranger's weaknesses is Thrust. This is a passive skill that gives plus 30 movement speed at max level. Between the various passive movement speed increases available, it wasn't too difficult for a Ranger to reach nearly max movement speed and jump height passively, even without Thrust. Faster movement speed is incredibly valuable on Rangers who struggle to maintain their minimum distance, even when given power knockback to help them out with that, but Thrust became less and less valuable as the game was updated and new gear was released. Puppet is one of the most unique and interesting skills in all of MapleStory. Over the years, its design has been recycled to be used in various skills that were given to other classes. I believe the most accurate modern version of this skill is Wind Archer's Emerald Flower. Using this skill will summon a puppet that pulls aggro off of the Ranger until it runs out of health or expires after 60 seconds. This skill is one of the major contributors to a skilled Ranger or Bowmaster's ability to solo certain bosses. Being able to keep a boss focused on the puppet can keep them alive in situations that would usually not be survivable. I've never gotten good enough at using it personally, but I've seen many Papulatus solos that utilized Puppet. Inferno is the next skill. This is a fire element ranged AoE attack. There's not much to explain about it, but the general perception of this skill was that it was useless when put up against Ranger's other mobbing skill. Eventually, toward the end of the pre-Big Bang era, Inferno would receive a buff that gave it a damage over time effect, which shifted public perception of it ever so slightly. Rangers, like a few other third job classes, also receive a skill that consumes a summoning rock to summon a companion. In this case, the Silver Hawk. Silver Hawk will fly around, occasionally attacking enemies and stunning them at up to a 99% success rate. This now makes two different skills that a Ranger can use to stun enemies, as well as an elemental attack and a decoy skill. Taking advantage of a Ranger's wide array of utility was one of the things that contributed to their skill ceiling and gave them the capabilities to do just about anything. Strafe might just be one of the best skills in the game. Not necessarily because it's the strongest or most impactful, or by any measurable metric. It's just cool as hell and extremely satisfying to use. Double Shot was a super fun skill. I think it's actually quite underrated in terms of how viscerally satisfying it was, but Strafe takes that visceral satisfaction a step further, and this is easily one of my highest tier picks for my best skills in the game tier list. One last thing to note about Strafe is that because it fired 4 arrows, it outdamaged Double Shot as soon as it had a single point added to it, which was very nice for Rangers. They could immediately ditch double shot the moment they reached third job. Most classes weren't able to ditch their previous skills that quickly. Mortal Blow is a skill I feel slightly less passionate about. It passively gives a chance to fire a single arrow if the ranger attempts to shoot a bow while standing too close to an enemy, but it has a secondary effect that I never really thought had much of an impact, if any, on the gameplay. If a monster has less than 50% HP and Mortal Blow is procced, it has a 10% chance to immediately kill the enemy. I'm pretty sure this doesn't apply to bosses. That would be extremely overpowered. As cool as the idea of instantly killing a monster is, a 10% success rate locked behind a less than 50% HP requirement with a 70% proc rate that required the ranger to be too close to the enemy to fire an arrow basically meant this never happened. And when it did, I'm not sure the player would even notice or care. Finally, we reach Arrow Rain. I think this is one of the better third job mobbing skills, and it also gives the ranger a bit of a break, since it has no minimum range requirement. You can effectively stand inside an enemy and still successfully use Arrow Rain. This is yet another tool that rangers were given that expanded their capabilities even further. They were no longer necessarily restricted to slow-moving monsters or forced to stun their opponents in order to get a kill. Arrow Rain is an amazing skill not because it's the strongest attack in the game, but because of the freedom it finally granted rangers. With their new skills, rangers were capable of utilizing a variety of training spots. They weren't necessarily funneled into areas that catered to one specific playstyle like we often find with other classes, and they could do all sorts of things from sniping to traditional mobbing and even hunting bosses on their own. During the El Nath era of the game, there were some options that were okay, but generally training spots came down to optimizing how much EXP was received per use of strafe. If it took 2 strafes to kill a single Pepe, it would be more beneficial to train at Hector's, who would instead die in 1 hit. This was something that rangers would already be familiar with, as 2-shotting enemies was almost always required for a new training spot to become viable. This wasn't always the case, especially with Arrow Bomb, but as monsters in third job and beyond started to possess more HP, single-target attacks had a bit more of a role in grinding. Sometimes rangers would want to grind on more powerful monsters just to mix things up or hunt for specific items. 2-shotting was a good rule to follow, but it wasn't a requirement. Strafe's increase in damage over double shot quickly opens up the option of training on squids in Aquarium, which was added during this third job era of the game. Squids are a pretty decent spot over gobies, who have the issue of canceling weapon attack very frequently. Between Arrow Bomb and Hawk, though, it was reasonable to train at gobies for a ranger, but it required more active gameplay. Stunning them would prevent them from canceling weapon attack. Squids are a top pick for me in third job personally. I love training here. Rangers, just like hermits and other ranged attackers, really thrived at squids. Level 90 is around the breakpoint where rangers can begin solo bossing, once they have strafe maxed and a few points in puppet. But the options were extremely limited for a while. Headless Horseman would first be added in version 44, and at first it was only available on one map that was filled with junior wraiths. While this was a problem for most ranged attackers at this point, rangers were uniquely equipped with Puppet and Hawk to easily take down this area boss. Puppet would draw aggro and allow control of Headless Horseman, and Hawk could fly around protecting the ranger from stray weak enemies who might come along and knock them around, potentially putting the player in danger. This boss had the best HP to EXP ratio available in all of third job, and it's very fun to boss with Puppet on a ranger. This was also good practice for a future Bowmaster. Each Headless Horseman gave 300,000 EXP, so as long as they were able to kill more than about 3 per hour, it was really good EXP, even if a single kill could feel like it took a long time. With the release of Leafree, which came out right at the end of this third job era, a new training area for rangers opened up. With strafe and a lot of patience, nudies could be sniped pretty early on in third job. And this is where you can really see a difference between a hermit's and a ranger's attacking range. The small advantage rangers have allowed them just a bit more safety from the nudies' powerful ranged attacks. Even if we ignore this fact, a decent level of Hawk will allow the Ranger to snipe 2 nudies at once, since the Hawk will instantly attack the closest one the moment it spawns, stunning it and preventing it from casting magic damage on the player. This is another training spot I've personally utilized in the past. I really enjoy sniping enemies as an archer, there's just something really satisfying about it, but the EXP rates here aren't amazing. There are better options in terms of EXP per hour, and sniping is usually only good if you're trying to lazy grind. But hey, at least archers had the option to lazy grind back in the day, a luxury some classes did not have. It's only after level 100 or so that things start to become a bit rough for this class. There aren't a ton of amazing options for grinding other than Himeis, which can be pretty difficult for a solo ranger. But in OSMS, we have our priests to carry us and remove a lot of the pot burn and threat of dying. In a party, Himeis were just fine on a ranger. Spirit Vikings were also doable. These were monsters found in Deep Looty, which was released shortly after Third Job came out. Spirit Vikings hit hard, but a ranger could abuse the hitbox glitch that Spirit Vikings had with their projectiles, just like a hermit could. With their slightly increased attacking range compared to a hermit, they were at even less risk of dying when playing properly. Plus, they had Puppet to help with manipulating aggro. This rough period of level 100 to 120 is most definitely not exclusive to rangers. Most classes struggle through these levels, but with one of the best options available not being amazing for a solo ranger, it can seem a lot more difficult for them. Third Job is where rangers tend to develop a ton of patience. This is of course assuming they haven't already from First Job's minimum attacking distance, or Second Job's mindless Monkey Forest 2 grind, or all the sniping they might have done when lazily grinding. Bowmasters are the most patient gamers in history. New Leaf City was a great addition for everyone. While rangers weren't able to take advantage of any of the training spots that came with the launch of NLC, rangers could grind at Wolf Spider's Cavern, but it was a very rough experience, similar to hermits. I don't think I would personally ever bother. New Leaf City introduced the ITCG crafting system as well, and there were a few bows that were tied to this system. First is the Winkle. I don't know what set of ITCG cards introduced this weapon, but it had fast attack speed, no strength requirement, and uncharacteristically low base weapon attack, which is probably one of the reasons why it wasn't seen too often. There's also the Andromeda bow crafted by the Glimmer Man. The stats and requirements on the Andromeda bow are actually identical to the Hinkle bows, which are the traditional level 70 options. Finally, set 3 of the ITCG card codes could give the player an Akka. Using a few materials, as well as the player having a pet who was level 15 or higher, this weapon could be upgraded by Corrine into an Akka Suma, the level 40 version. The final upgrade available for the Akka bow was the Akka Magna, which once again required a few materials and a level 30 pet, which was not a simple task at all. I don't think I've ever had a level 30 pet on any character in any era of MapleStory. The Akka weapons were all decent, but it was the Akka Magna that really stood out. The 2 lower level versions both had alternative weapon choices that were either much easier to acquire or better, but the Akka Magna didn't have any strong competition at its level. It required less strength than the Arund bows, which were the traditional level 80 options, and it also had 5 attack speed and a higher base weapon attack. This would have been the best weapon to use until endgame, though getting your hands on one was no small task, and it would require the ranger to begin building low strength a bit earlier than normal. After getting through the rougher levels of ranger and eventually reaching level 120, Terransko is now allowed to become a Bowmaster. With Puppet and some skill, rangers are actually capable of taking down Manon and Griffey themselves. They have the tools necessary, it's just a matter of utilizing them properly, and most important of all, not getting one-shot. Aside from the common skills Maple Warrior and Heroes will, the first skill a Bowmaster receives is Sharp Eyes. This is a party buff that increases crit rate and crit damage, even giving classes who couldn't normally crit a small chance to do so. For a huge number of Old School MapleStory players, this is what Bowmasters are known for. Sharp Eyes contributes such a huge amount of damage to Night Lords, the premier DPS class, and outside of that, it generally increased DPS for everyone. Dragon's Breath is an upgraded ranged version of Hunter's power knockback skill. It can be fired from a distance and always knocks back the enemies at a 100% success rate. A skill that doesn't have a big presence in the memories of OSMS players, but did have its uses. Hurricane is Bowmaster's big fourth job skill. It was such a well-designed, iconic, and powerful skill that it finds its way in modern MapleStory on multiple classes in, of course, a more updated form. This skill will fire 8 arrows per second, and it locks the Bowmaster in place while held. The implications of a skill like this, that fires individual arrows non-stop at such a fast speed, made Bowmasters even better at solo bossing and gave them massive damage potential. Hamstring is a pretty forgettable skill. This is actually a buff skill that gives every arrow fired a chance to slow the target. This sounds very helpful, but at this point, Bowmasters were given so many tools that it didn't have enough of an impact to be remembered and was extremely low priority, often being the final skill a Bowmaster levels. Phoenix is an upgraded version of Hawk. It can't stun enemies, but it does deal fire elemental damage. This wasn't all that much of an upgrade from Hawk in terms of utility without the stunning capabilities, but it was a huge upgrade in terms of damage dealt. Bow Expert is a passive skill, and similar to Dark Knight's Beholder, it passively increases bow mastery even further to a maximum of 90%, helping Bowmasters reach a more consistent level of damage output, which had been an issue for them up until this point. The final skill for a Bowmaster is Concentrate. This skill gave plus 26 weapon attack and reduced mana consumption by 50%. In its original iteration, it had a 6-minute cooldown, and with those being the only buffs the skill gave, it was a relatively low priority skill for a Bowmaster. Concentrate may not have been an amazing skill, but it did have a very helpful niche in solo bossing. Hurricane was pretty mana intensive, consuming nearly 100 MP per second. Potions could not be used while Hurricane was firing, and if Hurricane wasn't firing, the boss wouldn't be knocked back and could gain ground on the squishy Bowmaster, which was obviously quite dangerous for them. Concentrate simply allowed the Bowmaster to hold Hurricane for a longer period of time before needing to repot, which made certain bosses a bit safer while Concentrate was up. That's not to say that Concentrate was useless outside of this niche, but that 6-minute cooldown held it back pretty severely. Let's talk about Sharp Eyes. Sharp Eyes is an incredible skill. It gave every class a chance to deal crit damage, and the majority of classes in OSMS simply didn't have this capability without Sharp Eyes. It made both Bowmasters and Marksmen extremely popular to the point where they were basically mandatory for any bossing party. A Nightlord for damage output, a Bishop for support, a Dark Knight for hyper body, a Bowmaster or Marksman for Sharp Eyes and damage output, and then 2 slots that could be filled with any other class. This is the usual composition that you'd find in a generic bossing party. These classes all held skills that often couldn't be skipped, with perhaps the exception of Dark Knight's hyper body if everyone was sufficiently tanky. Sharp Eyes would even outperform Speed Infusion, a skill that is highly sought after by warriors, marksmen, and corsairs. The increase in attack speed often couldn't beat out the damage increase that Sharp Eyes would provide. This is obviously a very min-maxy scenario, and Buccaneers were still taken into bossing parties quite often for Speed Infusion and Time Leap. Not to mention how Speed Infusion still found plenty of use as a support buff for training. If a character was already dealing sufficient damage to the monsters they were training on, Speed Infusion would have a larger impact on EXP rates than the increase in damage from Sharp Eyes would. 3 new bows were made available in version 54. This was not only the release of Showa Town, but it was also the start of the 3rd anniversary event in GMS. 2 events that shouldn't have lined up, but did for GMS. The 3rd anniversary event brought a new level 64 bow, the Maple Condiva bow. Similar to a Maple Skanda, this bow was considered very good. It could hold a hunter over all the way until they became a ranger and got their endgame weapon around level 100. It had the fastest attack speed of any bow, 5, and required no stats. It was only available as a random drop during the anniversary events, so it was a highly sought after and hard to find weapon depending on the time of year. An alternative was available, however. Showa brought 2 new bows into the game with its release. One of these was a new level 65 bow, the Bow of Magical Destruction. This bow had normal weapon attack and no stat requirements, but its 6 attack speed and higher level requirement compared to a Maple Condiva bow made it technically worse. This bow should have been released well before this 3rd anniversary event, but it wasn't. It never received its time in the spotlight. If we didn't get a weird, dumb, censored version of Showa in GMS, this bow might have actually had a chance to be a very dominant choice for high-level hunters and low-level rangers. It's still a beloved and well-remembered bow regardless, and it was a good pick when Condiva bows were in short supply. The other bow that came with Showa was the Cow bow. This dropped from Red Slimes, but it was also available from Gachapon. High attack speed, regular stat requirements, and a weird level requirement made this bow memorable, but not exceptional. With Wind Raiders and Crimsonwood Forest, Bigfoot was finally added to the game in version 59, an area boss who gave a whopping 2.66 million EXP per kill. With clever placement of puppet and abuse of iframes, Bigfoot could be pinned in the corner with Hurricane indefinitely until it was dead. This was absolutely mindless after the setup, and also completely safe as long as the Bowmaster was aware of the attack limit. This is a hidden number that incremented with every attack. After this limit was reached, the player would no longer be able to deal damage, and their attacks wouldn't work. Moving around would reset the attack limit back down to 0, so it was mostly an anti-bot measure that didn't actually affect regular players too significantly. Both Puppet and Phoenix were invaluable tools in this setup. Puppet made it a lot easier to set up the pin, and Phoenix served as a guardian, similar to Hawk's role in Headless Horseman solos. Again, we find 2 tools here that only Bowmasters and Marksmen had access to, elevating their status as solo bossing gods even further, though Bowmasters had Hurricane, which was an incredibly strong skill. Along with the release of Bigfoot, a bunch of Headless Horseman spawns were added in version 59, and the Crimsonwood Forest became a ranged attacker's solo bossing dream area. We're reaching the end of the road in terms of available equips as soon as the early 100s, and there are actually no special options for endgame bows in Old School MapleStory. The closest we see to any kind of special option is the VIP bow, which didn't become very accessible until after Big Bang. There were no downsides to this bow, and it was the highest level option by the end of the pre-Big Bang era. This lack of special choice makes Bowmasters one of the few classes who actually want to use the highest level option available. This was usually a Nizrock or a Crimson Arc Lancer, maybe even a Dragon Shiner bow if the Bowmaster was incredibly well geared. The best option in this case, though, was the Timeless Ingaw. When fully leveled and completely maxed, this bow is an absolute monster. A lot of classes optimally wouldn't be using these pink bean locked weapons due to either their high secondary stat requirements or their attack speed. Armor for archers didn't require any secondary stats, so they could use the highest level options available and scroll them for strength, resulting in a low strength build like we saw with Nightlord's low dex build. Add as few points as possible directly into strength and try to reach the amount required to equip your bow with your scrolled gear. Strengthless simply wasn't a viable build for Bowmasters since there was no high-level strengthless bow. Classes whose primary stat was dex were unfortunately given the short stick when it came to a lot of their gear. There were multiple item slots that simply had no strength scroll options for a while, so they'd have to stack primary stat on their helmet, their shoes, their earrings. This resulted in less accessibility to their secondary stat from scrolled equips, but this was at least partially made up for by the fact that their armor had no strength requirements at all. The highest level bows were the best option in terms of damage, but managing strength to actually have enough to equip high level bows without losing damage was reserved for the most funded and powerful Bowmasters, who had some of the greatest gear. It was a delicate balance that was made even tougher with their lack of scrolling options, but it also gave Bowmasters some incredibly high potential, especially when coupled with Hurricane. As the game reached the Big Bang update, a lot of items and scrolls were added that alleviated this issue of a Bowmaster's lack of access to strength on gear. This was the case for every class, and Bowmasters were one of the classes who benefited the most, becoming noticeably more powerful as the game was updated. Rangers already had such a strong solo bossing kit by 3rd job, and with 4th job and the addition of Hurricane, this kit was elevated to a level that almost nobody else could match. Headless Horseman was just a warm-up, a simple boss who could be killed in 3rd job as early as level 90. After 4th job, however, Bowmasters begin to gain access to a huge number of powerful bosses that they're capable of soloing who can give them huge amounts of EXP all at once. Bigfoot, Papulatus, Onego, Black Crow. This list only grew as the game was updated. Remember earlier when I said that a Bowmaster's unstable damage would actually prove helpful eventually? Well, it was after unlocking Hurricane, a skill that attacked very quickly, that these critical damage spikes that were once a minor annoyance to a hunter or a ranger would become a benefit for a Bowmaster, increasing their overall damage output tremendously. This was amplified even further with Sharp Eyes, and without these damage spikes, a Bowmaster just wouldn't be nearly as strong. Bowmasters could solo just about anything, as long as they had the HP, which was really their only weakness, and this wasn't necessarily a limiting factor with the presence of Puppet if the Bowmaster was skilled enough. They had extraordinary DPS output, which scaled really well due to the way Hurricane was designed. Their ability to pin an enemy in place with Hurricane and drop aggro with Puppet meant that they even had tools that Night Lords didn't have. A Bowmaster could legitimately solo boss from the early 120s all the way to 200 and still make good time. There was also the option of party bossing. A Bowmaster would be accepted into just about any bossing party because of Sharp Eyes, whether there was a Night Lord present or not. Though it's worth noting that while Sharp Eyes was a very appealing addition to a party, there were sometimes instances where archers would be rejected if the team wanted a very optimized party composition. Bowmasters did not provide the greatest DPS when compared to a Night Lord or Corsair. On top of that, Hurricane could only hit one target at a time, and in content that benefited heavily from classes who could attack multiple monsters at once, they were also not a high priority pick. So while I may have painted this picture of Bowmaster being the most desired class in the game, that wasn't always the case. One Sharp Eyes Mule is all you truly need after all, and this is how some people perceived bossing back in the day. As the game was updated and we got closer to the Big Bang update, Bowmasters received the most consistent improvements, as their total strength added from gear would continue to rise with every update. They were always a ridiculously strong class, there's no arguing that, but they were underappreciated for a long time. It wasn't until the end of OSMS and the early days of Big Bang that Bowmasters started to become more appreciated outside of their Sharp Eyes identity. Sharp Eyes was taken for granted, since it was a skill available on 2 classes. Once potentials were added, we saw decent Sharp Eyes make its way into the game for the first time, and this finally started the process of allowing Bowmasters to have their own identity. After a certain point, players simply referred to Bowmasters or Marksmen as Sharp Eyes. That's all they were to the majority of players. Once everyone had access to this skill, these classes were no longer bound by their Sharp Eyes curse, and they truly began to demonstrate to the Maple world how powerful they were. And that, dear viewers, is the story of Bowmaster in Old School MapleStory. Hey, thanks for watching. I just want to give a quick shout out to my supporters on YouTube and Patreon for their continued support. In the big tier, we have Jerry L, Anonymous, Evan Bat Eater, Jacob, Mushba, Sock Ears, Joseph H, and Ray From. And a big thank you to everyone else as well. Your support helps keep these videos going.